Catherine sat in the sleek office of her financial firm, fingers gliding over the cool surface of her desk as she scanned the latest reports. To anyone looking in, she was the embodiment of control, precise, composed with an air of quiet dominance. But beneath that polished exterior, a slow burn of fury simmered, restrained only by the patience of a woman who knew how to wait for the perfect moment to strike. The divorce papers lay on the table before her, neatly stacked, as if they were just another financial document awaiting her approval. But there was nothing ordinary about this. This was war, and her soon-to-be ex-husband, Mark, had made a grave miscalculation by thinking he had already won. She had anticipated a fight. Mark was never the type to bow out gracefully, especially when he had convinced himself that he was the mastermind in every room he entered. A slick talker with a dazzling smile, he had built his entire persona around the illusion of effortless success. When they had first met, that charm had been intoxicating. He had seemed brilliant, ambitious, the kind of man who could turn any setback into an opportunity. But over the years, the cracks had formed, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. The financial mistakes that were never mistakes at all, the growing arrogance, the casual disregard for her intelligence. He had built his success off of her careful planning, her meticulous calculations, and yet he never acknowledged it. Worse, he had begun to believe his own lies, that she was merely an accessory to his rise, not the force behind it. When she had finally decided to end it, she had expected resistance, but nothing quite like this. Mark had moved swiftly, with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. He had orchestrated a financial ambush, filing documents that claimed full ownership of their marital assets, transferring funds under shell companies, and making sure that on paper Catherine looked like nothing more than a dependent. The house they had bought together, the investments she had painstakingly built, even the joint business ventures, they had all been siphoned away into his control before she could even file her own claims. By the time she realized the full extent of his maneuvering, he had already positioned himself as the sole financial authority in their marriage. And yet, as he had leaned back in his leather chair the night he smugly presented her with the papers, the ones that reduced her to an afterthought, she had only smiled. Mark, in all his arrogance, had believed she would crumble. He had expected tears, screaming, maybe even a desperate plea for fairness. What he had not expected was her silence, the slight tilt of her head, the calculating look in her eyes as she ran her fingers over the glossy pages and simply said, "Noted." Because Catherine was not the kind of woman who acted on impulse. She was not the type to throw plates or shout across courtrooms. No, Catherine was the kind of woman who dismantled empires brick by brick, piece by piece, until the man sitting at the top of the throne looked down and realized there was nothing left beneath him. Mark had made the mistake of thinking he had won. What he failed to understand was that Catherine had never even stepped onto the battlefield until now. For weeks, she played the role he expected. The abandoned wife, blindsided and grieving, too stunned to fight back. She let him revel in his triumph, allowed him to believe that his clever little schemes had worked. She ignored the condescending emails from his lawyer, the gloating messages that dripped with barely concealed mockery. She even let him enjoy his social life, parading around town with that young, wide-eyed intern who thought she was stepping into a life of wealth and power. But behind the scenes, Catherine was quietly rearranging the pieces. She had learned long ago that real power was not in grand gestures or public declarations, but in the details, the unnoticed shifts, the subtle recalibrations that changed the entire landscape before anyone even realized it. Mark had been so focused on his own brilliance that he had failed to notice hers. Now, as she signed the papers before her, the first move in a game he did not yet know he was playing, she allowed herself the faintest smile. He thought he had buried her. He thought he had outsmarted her. What he did not realize was that Catherine had already begun digging his grave. The call came just as Catherine was finishing a meeting. She recognized Mark's number immediately but felt nothing but quiet amusement. He never called unless he had something to gloat about, and considering how much he thought he had won, he was likely savoring his imagined victory. She let the phone ring twice before answering. "Hello, Mark," she said, her voice smooth, indifferent. "Katie," he stretched out her name like an old lover trying to stir up nostalgia. "I was beginning to think you were avoiding me." "Busy," she said simply. She could hear the smirk in his voice. "Well, I won't keep you. Just wanted to give you the courtesy of a heads up before you get the official documents. The house transfer is finalized, the assets are fully accounted for, and, well, I suppose you'll want to start looking for a new place. Wouldn't want you caught off guard." Catherine glanced out the window, watching the light glint off the glass buildings. He really thought he was being generous, giving her a few days' notice before she was unceremoniously locked out of what had once been her home. She imagined him sitting in his favorite chair, drink in hand, feet propped up on the coffee table she had picked out, waiting for the moment she would break. She smiled. "That's thoughtful of you, Mark. I do appreciate the warning." There was a pause. He had expected something else: anger, frustration, maybe even desperation. Not this. "Well," he said, covering his confusion with arrogance, "I always try to be civil. No hard feelings, right?" "None at all," she replied, almost cheerful. Another pause. Then, as if deciding he had better things to do than entertain a conversation that wasn't going as planned, he sighed. "Good. Well, I guess this is it, then. Best of luck, Katie." She let the name slide off her back. "You too, Mark." She placed her phone down and turned to her laptop. The next phase had begun. Mark had falsified the house transfer documents, forging her signature, manipulating records, bribing someone to push it through quickly. On paper, everything looked airtight. If she had been anyone else, someone without her level of financial expertise, he might have gotten away with it. But Catherine had spent her career spotting discrepancies, catching fraud buried under legal jargon and fabricated documents. And she knew one thing for certain: people like Mark never covered their tracks as well as they thought. She pulled up the scanned copies of their original mortgage and property agreements, the ones that proved she was the sole owner. The house had been transferred to her name fully after refinancing last year, a detail Mark had clearly forgotten. Then she retrieved the emails she had intercepted, messages between Mark and his lawyer, the ones he had believed were secure. They discussed their strategy to remove her from ownership, reroute funds, manipulate legal loopholes to make it appear as if she had willingly forfeited her rights. The arrogance in his words was palpable. He had truly believed no one would challenge him. Every transaction, every falsified document, every sign of deliberate fraud was meticulously compiled. Mark had moved quickly, assuming speed meant efficiency, but he had left too many loose ends, and now those loose ends would tighten into a noose around his neck. With a few keystrokes, she forwarded the evidence to her attorney. Subject line: "Let's proceed." The documents Mark mentioned arrived the next day, delivered by a courier who had no idea he was handing her nothing more than the remnants of a failed illusion. She accepted them without reaction, flipping through the pages like they were meaningless. Because they were. The real impact came later, when Mark received his own set of documents, this time from her legal team. The same evidence he had so confidently hidden behind fraudulent agreements was now in the hands of people who could dismantle every last one of his schemes. She pictured his reaction as he opened the envelope, read the first page, and realized she had been 5 steps ahead of him the entire time. She didn't have to imagine for long. The call came soon after. Mark's number. This time, she let it go to voicemail. When she checked the message, his voice was tight with anger. "Catherine, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but you're making a mistake. Call me back." She didn't. Instead, she smiled, poured herself a glass of wine, and closed her laptop. The game had only just begun. Catherine didn't rush. She knew that the best traps were the ones that took time to tighten, the kind that lulled the prey into a false sense of security before snapping shut with no escape. Mark thought he was still in control. He believed she was just beginning to realize what he had done, still scrambling to figure out her next move. What he didn't know was that she had already made it. She spent the next few days as if nothing had changed, She went to work, attended meetings, even had dinner with a friend, all while Mark likely sat at home waiting for her to react. He wanted a fight, a confrontation, something to make him feel victorious. She gave him nothing. He had no idea that, while he was celebrating, she was carefully dismantling everything he had built. Mark had always been careless with details. He moved fast, made impulsive decisions, always assuming that his charm and confidence would cover for any mistakes. He could spin a lie effortlessly, but he never worried about making it airtight. He assumed no one would look too closely. Catherine had always been the one cleaning up his messes, making sure things were done properly, handling the fine print. And now those oversights were coming back to haunt him. She began with the business accounts. Mark had spent years using their joint finances as his personal playground, shifting money around to make himself look more successful than he actually was. He had never imagined she would have access to records he thought were hidden. But Catherine had always kept her own copies, backup files he had never known about, tracking every transaction, every withdrawal, every transfer he had made. She reached out to an old contact at the bank, someone who had always appreciated her attention to detail. With a simple request, she had Mark's recent activity pulled and compared against the legal records he had submitted in the divorce. The discrepancies were obvious. He had lied about assets, hidden funds, and manipulated numbers. Not only was it fraudulent, but it was also reckless. She had the reports sent to her lawyer, who wasted no time filing the necessary motions. Within a matter of days, an official inquiry had been launched. Mark wouldn't know yet, not until his accounts were flagged, until his transactions started getting blocked, until he tried to move more money and realized he no longer had full access. He would panic, but by the time he figured out what was happening, it would be too late to fix. Next was the house. Mark had been so focused on stealing it from her that he had overlooked the simplest problem: he couldn't actually afford it on his own. He had taken on additional loans to cover the payments, assuming that once Catherine was gone, he would have no trouble keeping up. But she knew better. She knew his financial habits, his spending patterns, the way he lived beyond his means to maintain an illusion of wealth. She had already been in touch with the mortgage company, providing them with proof of his fraudulent property transfer. It didn't take much for them to launch their own investigation. Once they realized the extent of the deception, they froze any further changes to ownership. The house could not be sold, refinanced, or leveraged for more credit, not without Catherine's approval. The beauty of it all was that Mark still didn't know. He was likely feeling triumphant, thinking he had maneuvered everything perfectly, believing that Catherine was helpless. He would only start to notice when the small inconveniences began piling up. A delayed transaction here, a declined payment there, phone calls from the bank that sounded a little too serious. And just when he thought he could smooth it all over, that's when the real blow would land. She wanted him to feel it slowly, to sense the shift in power before he could name it. She wanted him to sit in the house he thought he had stolen, surrounded by his stolen life, and feel the unease creeping in. He had built everything on a foundation of lies, and Catherine was simply letting gravity take its course. The first real crack appeared when Mark called her again. She let it ring, waited for the voicemail, and then played the message with a satisfied smirk. "Catherine, this is ridiculous. You're being petty. I don't know what you think you're doing, but I'm not in the mood for games. Call me back." It was the first sign of tension in his voice. The first indication that he knew something was wrong, even if he couldn't quite put his finger on it yet. She let him stew in it. Then, a day later, another call. "Catherine, we need to talk. No more arrogance, no more smugness. Just a demand, edged with frustration." She deleted it without response. When the third message came, she could hear the shift. The worry, the uncertainty. What the hell is going on? "The bank is asking questions. My accounts." He cut himself off, breathing heavily. "You need to call me." She didn't. And, because the final phase was about to begin, Mark had spent years underestimating her. He had assumed that because she was quiet, because she didn't engage in petty fights, because she always played fair, that she was weak. But Catherine had never been weak. She had simply been patient. And now, that patience was paying off. By the end of the week, Mark's name was flagged in multiple financial investigations. The IRS had been alerted to his inconsistencies. His fraudulent business transactions had been exposed. The house was in limbo, ownership frozen in legal disputes. The reality he had built for himself was beginning to crumble, and Catherine? She was still waiting, because the best part was yet to come. Mark was unraveling. Catherine could see it in the frantic calls she continued to ignore, in the desperate emails forwarded to her attorney, in the panicked rumors trickling back to her from mutual acquaintances. The confident, arrogant man who had declared himself the winner of this battle was starting to realize that he had never been in control at all. She had let him believe it, had even allowed him to celebrate, while she carefully rearranged the ground beneath his feet. Now, with every passing day, he was starting to feel the cracks beneath him widen. She had been meticulous. Mark's financial world was a carefully constructed illusion, and illusions were delicate things. They relied on the people around him believing he was as wealthy, as powerful, as untouchable as he claimed to be. Catherine had no interest in directly confronting him. There was no need. All she had to do was introduce doubt. And now that doubt was spreading like poison through everything he had built. The first true consequence landed on a Wednesday morning. Mark had made an appointment with his banker, undoubtedly expecting to smooth things over with his usual charm and half-truths. What he had not expected was to be met with cold professionalism and an audit team waiting to discuss recent irregularities. Catherine didn't need to be there to know exactly how it had gone. Mark would have walked in, all easy confidence, his usual smirk in place. He would have leaned back in his chair, expecting reassurances, expecting to hear that everything was just a minor inconvenience. And then, slowly, it would have dawned on him. The concerned expressions, the legal jargon being carefully, deliberately used, the sudden realization that the people in that room weren't looking at him with admiration or deference anymore. They were looking at him like a liability. By noon, his credit lines had been frozen. By 3, he had left 6 messages for her. She listened to the last one, letting herself enjoy the barely controlled panic in his voice. Catherine, we need to fix this. I don't know what the hell you think you're doing, but you've made a mistake. Call me. Now. She smiled and deleted it. Because the next step had already been set into motion. Mark had thought the house was his greatest triumph. He had stolen it out from under her, forged documents, moved the right pieces, and convinced himself that he had secured his position. But the house was also his greatest weakness. He had leveraged too much of his finances against it, taken out loans in anticipation of future assets that now no longer existed. And Catherine had ensured that those debts had become glaring, undeniable problems. She had been subtle, patient. She had spoken with the right people, let the right whispers find their way to the right ears. Mark was a risk now. A man whose finances were under investigation, whose assets were in question. A man who might not be able to meet his obligations, and banks had no patience for uncertainty. The letter arrived the next day. A formal notice of default. His payments had been flagged, his refinancing options revoked, his ability to use the house as collateral stripped away. It was the first real hit he couldn't ignore, and Catherine knew that, for the first time, he was beginning to panic. By Friday, mutual friends started reaching out. People who had once been firmly in Mark's camp, convinced of his brilliance, were suddenly hesitating. Hey, I don't know what's going on between you two, but Mark's. Well, he's not handling things well. Oh my God, have you heard? He lost his business account. I thought he was doing great. Listen, I know things got ugly, but he's asking around for money. He's acting like everything's fine, but I don't know, something's off. Catherine never responded to any of them. She simply let the rumors grow. Because the moment Mark realized he was in trouble, he did exactly what she knew he would. He tried to charm his way out of it. He started making calls, meeting with old contacts, trying to smooth things over with reassurances that he was handling everything. But the problem was, people like Mark only held power as long as others believed they had it. And now, his carefully crafted persona was starting to fracture. Investors hesitated. Business partners quietly started pulling back. And worst of all for Mark, the very people he had used to manipulate Catherine, the legal team he had so confidently employed, suddenly found themselves staring at a case that had gone from simple to legally toxic. The next call came late that night. She answered, just to hear him break. Catherine, his voice was different now. Gone was the arrogance, the laughter, the certainty. There was frustration, desperation, and underneath it all, a thin layer of fear. You're making a mistake. She didn't speak. She let the silence stretch, let him feel it. I don't know what you've done, but it stops now, he continued, his breath sharp. I don't care what kind of point you're trying to make, but you've gone too far. Catherine finally spoke, her voice smooth, calm. Have I? Mark exhaled sharply, like he was trying to regain control. I'm serious. You don't want to do this. You think you've won something here, but you haven't. I can fix this. But you need to back off. She smiled, even though he couldn't see it. Fix it, then. She ended the call before he could respond, because there was nothing left for him to fix. He just didn't know it yet. Mark was losing control, and Catherine could feel it. His confidence had cracked, his carefully curated image was slipping, and now he was scrambling, grasping at anything that might keep him from free falling. She had seen this before, not with him, but with others like him. Men who built their entire sense of power on illusion, on the belief that as long as they said the right things and smiled at the right people, nothing could touch them. Mark had always assumed that charm was his greatest weapon. What he never realized was that it only worked when people still believed in him. The unraveling was happening faster than even she had expected. The moment his finances had been frozen, the moment investors started hesitating, the moment the whispers of doubt reached the wrong ears, everything had begun to collapse. And Mark, for all his arrogance, was not built to withstand real failure. She watched from a distance, never reaching out, never engaging, as he desperately tried to hold his world together. He started calling in favors, trying to negotiate his way back into good standing. He assured people he had it under control, that this was just a temporary setback. But the problem with men like Mark was that they never planned for what would happen if people stopped believing them. The first real public blow landed when one of his longtime business contacts abruptly severed ties. It wasn't done quietly, word spread fast, and suddenly, Mark wasn't the confident entrepreneur with an untouchable reputation. He was a risk, a liability. Catherine didn't have to do anything. She had simply let the weight of his own mistakes pull him under. Then came the house. The notices had already been piling up, but Mark had convinced himself he could delay the inevitable. He had always been good at postponing consequences, at making just enough of a payment to keep people at bay, at lying with enough conviction to buy himself time. But time was no longer on his side. The mortgage company had already flagged his irregularities, and once the financial investigation officially reached them, there was no more room for negotiations. Catherine didn't have to be there when he received the final foreclosure warning to know how he had reacted. The fury, the disbelief, the sick realization that the one thing he had stolen from her was now slipping through his fingers. The house had never really been his. He had tricked himself into thinking it was, just like he had tricked himself into thinking he had won. She imagined him pacing through the empty rooms, the weight of what was happening finally pressing down on him. The grand victory he had imagined was gone, replaced by mounting legal troubles, by financial ruin, by the cold reality that no one was coming to save him. And yet, even in the face of all of it, Mark still thought he had a chance to turn things around. That was the part that almost made her laugh. When the next call came, she knew it wasn't out of anger. It was desperation. Catherine, his voice was tight, controlled, but she could hear the strain underneath it. We need to talk. She let the silence stretch, just enough to make him uncomfortable. About what? You know damn well about what. I really don't. She could hear him exhale sharply, like he was trying to hold back his frustration. I'm being civil here, Catherine. I'm trying to fix this before it gets worse. She tilted her head, even though he couldn't see her. Worse for who? There was a pause. A second too long. For both of us, he finally said. But she could hear it now. He wasn't calling to negotiate. He wasn't calling to threaten her anymore. He was calling because he was afraid. Catherine leaned back in her chair, letting herself enjoy it. He had spent months believing he had outplayed her, that she was the one left scrambling. And now here he was, standing in the wreckage of everything he had built, realizing that the person he had dismissed as weak had been the one holding the real power all along. You did this to yourself, Mark, she said finally, her voice calm. He scoffed, but it was hollow. You think you're so clever, don't you? I think I'm done here. Before he could say anything else, she ended the call. Because there was nothing left to say. Mark had always believed he could talk his way out of anything. He had spent years perfecting the art of manipulation, knowing exactly when to act remorseful, when to shift blame, when to play the victim. It had worked on colleagues, investors, even friends who should have known better. But this time, there was no one left to convince. No amount of charm or well-crafted excuses could undo what was coming. The courtroom was cold, impersonal. A stark contrast to the life he had so carefully built on illusions. He sat at the defendant's table, shoulders tense, his usual confidence nowhere to be seen. Across from him, Catherine sat perfectly poised, her expression unreadable, as if all of this were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. That was what rattled him the most. She wasn't angry. She wasn't gloating. She was just done with him. The judge read through the evidence methodically, without emotion. Fraudulent financial records, falsified signatures, misappropriation of assets. Each revelation tightened the noose around Mark's neck, piece by piece, until even he had to realize there was no way out. The property transfer was deemed invalid. The mortgage company had initiated foreclosure, and the IRS was now fully involved in investigating his hidden accounts. His lawyer tried to fight, tried to argue technicalities, but it was useless. The evidence was airtight. Every move Catherine had made calculated with surgical precision. The final blow came when the judge delivered his ruling: full financial restitution, immediate forfeiture of assets, and pending charges that could escalate if further discrepancies were found. Mark's hands clenched into fists. He had thought he was the one pulling the strings, that Catherine would simply fade into the background, powerless against him. But now, as he sat in front of the very system he had tried to manipulate, he finally understood. She had never been scrambling to keep up, she had been dismantling him from the very start. He turned to look at her, searching for something: regret, hesitation, anything that might tell him this had been difficult for her. But Catherine only met his gaze with quiet indifference, as if he were nothing more than a bad investment she had finally written off. And just like that, it was over. Mark had always been terrified of silence. He thrived on noise, on deals being made, on people talking about him, on the illusion of movement even when nothing was actually happening. But now, as he sat in the empty shell of what had once been his life, there was nothing but silence. No calls from business partners, no messages from lawyers, no friends left to reassure him that he could bounce back. Just the quiet weight of consequences pressing down on him. The house was gone. The assets were frozen. The money he had so carefully hidden was no longer his to control. Catherine had made sure of that. She hadn't just beaten him, she had erased every advantage he thought he had. There was no way to spin this, no clever escape. He was finished. He had tried reaching out to people who once owed him favors, but they had all distanced themselves the moment his downfall became public. Investors who had once lined up to shake his hand now refused to even acknowledge his calls. The woman he had so confidently flaunted as his new beginning had disappeared the second she realized there was nothing left to gain from him. She hadn't even bothered to say goodbye. And Catherine? She hadn't spoken to him since that day in court. She hadn't gloated, hadn't checked in to see the damage she had done. She had simply moved on, as if he were nothing more than an insignificant chapter she had finished reading. She had won because she never needed revenge. She didn't need to see him suffer. His suffering was inevitable. All she had to do was take away the power he had stolen, and the rest unraveled on its own. Somewhere across the city, Catherine was beginning again. The weight of him was gone, the burden of his manipulation nothing more than a distant memory. She had walked out of that courtroom free, untethered, ready for whatever came next. And Mark? Mark was alone, drowning in the wreckage of his own making. And for the first time in his life, there was no one left to save him.